The Tapestry of Home. The weaving begins. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the small town of Willow Creek. In a quiet neighborhood, nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac, stood a modest two-story house, its white paint slightly peeling and the garden overgrown with wildflowers. Despite its worn exterior, the house emanated warmth, a place where memories were made, laughter echoed, and love endured. The Harrison family had lived in that house for generations. It was where Eleanor and George Harrison had raised their 3 children, Tom, Sarah, and Claire. Now, the children had grown up and moved away, but the house still buzzed with life. Eleanor, now in her 70s, sat on the porch swing, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a baby blanket. The blanket was for Sarah, who was expecting her first child. Eleanor's mind wandered back to the days when her own children were young. She could almost hear their laughter, see them running through the garden, and feel the weight of their tiny bodies as she tucked them into bed at night. She missed those days, the chaos, the noise, the constant activity. But she also cherished the present, the calm after the storm, the time she now had to reflect on all that had passed. George came out onto the porch, a glass of iced tea in his hand. He handed it to Eleanor and sat down beside her, the wood of the swing creaking under his weight. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. "Do you think they'll be here on time?" Eleanor asked, her voice tinged with anticipation. "They'll be here," George replied, his voice steady and reassuring. "They always come home." The threads unravel. The next morning, the Harrison house was a hive of activity. Tom arrived first, his wife, Laura, and their 2 children, Max and Lily, in tow. Max, a lanky teenager with a mop of dark hair, immediately disappeared into the living room to play video games, while Lily, who was 10 and full of energy, ran into the garden to explore. Laura greeted Eleanor and George with warm hugs, and Tom followed suit, his eyes scanning the house with a mixture of nostalgia and melancholy. "It's good to be home," Tom said, though there was an underlying tension in his voice that Eleanor didn't miss. Soon after, Sarah arrived with her husband, Jack. Sarah was visibly pregnant, her belly round and full of life. Jack was attentive, always by her side, helping her with every small task. Eleanor's heart swelled with pride as she watched her daughter, now on the brink of motherhood herself. Last to arrive was Claire, the youngest of the Harrison siblings. She was the free spirit of the family, always traveling, always chasing dreams. She breezed in with a carefree smile, her hair wild and wind-blown. Claire was alone, as usual, but her presence filled the room with light. As the family gathered around the dining table for dinner, the familiar rhythm of conversation began. Stories were shared, laughter flowed, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But beneath the surface, there were undercurrents, unspoken tensions, unresolved conflicts, and unhealed wounds. Tom, the eldest, had always felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He was the one who had stayed close to home, the one who took over the family business, and the one who tried to keep everything together. But in doing so, he had grown resentful, feeling trapped by the expectations placed on him. Sarah, the middle child, had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth over the cracks in the family. But now, with a baby on the way, she was struggling with her own fears and insecurities. Would she be a good mother? Could she balance her career and her new responsibilities? The doubts gnawed at her, even as she tried to put on a brave face. Claire, the youngest, was the wild card. She had never fit into the mold that her parents had tried to create for her. She was always chasing something: adventure, freedom, the next big thing. But in her heart, she longed for a sense of belonging, for a place where she didn't have to run anymore. The loom tightens. As the days passed, the Harrison family settled into a familiar routine. Mornings were spent in the garden, afternoons exploring the town, and evenings gathered around the fire pit, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. But as they spent more time together, the underlying tensions began to surface. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Tom finally voiced what had been weighing on him for years. "I just don't understand why you're never around, Claire," Tom said, his voice edged with frustration. "Mom and Dad need help, and you're always off on some adventure. It's like you don't care about this family." Claire bristled at his words. "That's not fair, Tom. Just because I live my life differently doesn't mean I don't care. I just don't want to be tied down to one place. I'm happy with my life, and I wish you could understand that." "You're happy?" Tom shot back. "You're always running away from something, Claire. Maybe it's time you stopped running and faced whatever it is you're afraid of." The tension crackled in the air like a live wire. Eleanor, sensing that things were about to spiral out of control, stepped in. "That's enough, both of you," she said firmly. "This isn't the time or place for this." But the damage was done. Claire stood up abruptly, her eyes flashing with anger and hurt. "I'm going for a walk," she said, and without another word, she disappeared into the night. The family sat in silence, the fire crackling in the background. Tom looked down at his hands, regret washing over him. He hadn't meant to hurt Claire, but the weight of his own frustrations had gotten the better of him. Sarah, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "We're all just trying to do our best," she said softly. "Maybe we need to give each other a little more grace." Eleanor nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her children were struggling in ways she couldn't fix. The bonds that held them together were frayed, but they weren't broken, not yet. The ties that bind. As evening fell, Sarah went into labor. The family rushed to the hospital, their worries about Claire momentarily pushed aside. Hours passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation, until finally, the cries of a newborn filled the room. Sarah held her baby girl in her arms, tears streaming down her face. Eleanor and George stood by, their hearts overflowing with love for the newest member of their family. Tom, too, was overcome with emotion as he looked at his sister and her child. In that moment, the past and all its complications seemed to fade away, replaced by the simple, profound joy of new life. The next morning, Claire returned. She had walked to the old oak tree at the edge of town, a place where she had always gone to think. The night had given her clarity, and she knew she couldn't keep running forever. She needed her family, just as they needed her. When Claire arrived at the hospital, she found the family gathered around Sarah's bed, cooing over the baby. For a moment, she hesitated at the door, unsure of her place. But then Sarah looked up and smiled, beckoning her to come in. "Come meet your niece," Sarah said, her voice filled with warmth. Claire stepped into the room, and as she looked down at the tiny, perfect face of her niece, something shifted inside her. The restlessness that had driven her for so long seemed to quiet, replaced by a deep sense of belonging. Tom caught her eye and gave her a small nod, an unspoken apology, and an acknowledgement of their shared history. Claire nodded back, her heart full. The final stitch. Life in the Harrison household slowly returned to normal, But it was a new normal, one shaped by the events of the past few days. The family had faced their conflicts, and though the wounds hadn't fully healed, they had taken the first steps towards mending them. Tom learned to let go of some of the burdens he had carried for so long, realizing that he didn't have to shoulder everything on his own. Sarah embraced her new role as a mother, finding strength in the support of her family. And Claire, for the first time in her life, felt at peace with who she was and where she belonged. As the weeks passed, the Harrison family settled into a new rhythm. They still had their differences, but they were learning to navigate them with grace and understanding. The ties that bound them together had been tested, but they had emerged stronger and more resilient.